The Monterey Convention Center stood like a monument to ambition that evening, its glass facade reflecting the Pacific twilight in shades of amber and violet. Inside, under chandeliers that cast soft pools of light across polished marble floors, Hollywood's elite had gathered for an event that promised to honor the legends who had shaped the language of American cinema. The Hollywood Legends and Stunt Arts Gala was not merely a ceremony. It was a reunion of titans, a celebration of those who had transformed violence into art, danger into poetry, and raw physicality into unforgettable moments burned into the collective memory of generations. The main hall thrummed with quiet energy. Directors in tailored suits exchanged stories near the bar. Stunt coordinators, their bodies bearing the subtle scars of decades, spent perfecting falls and fights, clustered in small groups, their laughter punctuated by the clink of glasses. Actors who had once been household names moved through the crowd with the ease of people who had nothing left to prove. Photographers captured moments that would appear in glossy magazines and entertainment websites before dawn broke over the California coast. The air smelled of expensive cologne, fresh flowers, and the unmistakable scent of anticipation. Near the front of the hall, in a section cordoned off with velvet ropes and reserved for those whose names required no introduction, Steven Seagal sat alone. He wore black silk, as he always did, the mandarin collar of his jacket crisp and severe. Dark glasses obscured his eyes despite the indoor setting, and his silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a ponytail that fell halfway down his spine. His posture was impeccable, his expression unreadable. He did not acknowledge the occasional glances sent his way, nor did he respond to the photographers who periodically aimed their lenses in his direction. He simply sat, one hand resting lightly on his knee, the other occasionally adjusting the watch on his wrist. To those who did not know him, he appeared meditative, serene. To those who did, the stillness felt more like coiled wire, waiting. Steven Seagal had built a career on the image of the untouchable warrior. For more than 4 decades, he had moved through Hollywood as a man apart, someone who claimed knowledge that others could only approximate. He spoke often of his time training in Japan, of the masters who had taught him the ancient art of Aikido, of the principles of harmony and flow that underpinned every movement. He had advised law enforcement agencies, he said. He had trained special forces operatives in hand-to-hand combat. His films, filled with wrist locks and bone-breaking throws, reinforced the narrative. Steven Seagal was not just an actor. He was a 7th-degree black belt, a master of combat, a man whose skills transcended the choreographed violence of cinema. Tonight, he had come to be honored. And yet, as the evening wore on, a subtle tension began to settle over the hall. It was not something that could be easily identified. Not at first. It was in the way conversations seemed to pause when his name was mentioned. It was in the glances exchanged between stunt coordinators who had worked with him on set, memories flickering behind their eyes. It was in the careful politeness of those who approached him, offering handshakes and brief words of respect before moving on. As though lingering too long might invite something uncomfortable, Sarah Brennan felt that discomfort keenly as she made her way through the crowd, her recorder clutched in one hand and a press badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck. She was 28 years old, fresh-faced and eager, with barely 18 months of experience at the Pacific Film and Arts Journal. This assignment, a 5-minute interview with Steven Seagal, had felt like a gift when her editor handed it to her. Now, standing just outside the VIP section, watching the man through the velvet ropes, she was not so sure. Her editor's words echoed in her mind. Keep it respectful. Stick to his martial arts background. Don't ask about the lawsuits, the allegations. the controversies that had followed him for years. Just get the quote, get the soundbite, and move on. Sarah had nodded, had promised to be professional. But now, looking at the way Seagal sat, isolated even in a room full of people, she wondered what she was really walking into. When the publicist finally waved her over, Sarah took a breath, steadied herself, and approached. Seagal did not look up immediately. He waited, letting the silence stretch, until Sarah cleared her throat and introduced herself. Only then did he turn his head, slowly, and acknowledge her presence with the slightest inclination of his chin. Mr. Seagal, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Thank you for taking the time. It's an honor to speak with you tonight. She paused, waiting for a response. But none came. She pressed on. You're here among so many legends of film and stunt work. What does it mean to you to be part of this gathering? Seagal adjusted his glasses, a gesture that seemed deliberate, calculated. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured. Each word weighted with the authority of someone who expected to be believed without question. I've spent 45 years perfecting Aikido, he said. Most of the people in this room learned some moves for the cameras. There's a difference. Sarah blinked, surprised by the dismissal. She glanced at her recorder to make sure it was still running. There are several world-renowned stunt coordinators here tonight. She ventured carefully. And I understand Clint Eastwood is expected to arrive later. He's being honored for his contributions to Western cinema and his work with stunt teams over the decades. At the mention of Clint Eastwood's name, something shifted in Seagal's expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But Sarah caught it. A tightening around the mouth, a slight straightening of the shoulders. Clint, Seagal said, and the name came out flat, devoid of warmth. Look, I respect what Clint has done as a director. But let's be clear. He's a man who knows how to use a camera and props. He doesn't understand real combat. His films? They're Hollywood fantasies. Pretty pictures with no substance. Sarah felt the air shift. She could sense the cameraman behind her tensing. The lens still rolling. This was the kind of quote that would ignite comment sections, that would be clipped and shared and dissected before the night was even over. She should have moved on, should have thanked him and ended the interview. But something in her, perhaps ambition, perhaps simple curiosity, pushed her to ask one more question. Would you say there's a rivalry between you and Mr. Eastwood? Seagal's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. No rivalry, he said. I've trained special forces operatives. I understand real-world combat. Clint Eastwood, he directs stunt doubles and tells them where to stand. Different worlds entirely. The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Sarah thanked him, her mind already racing ahead to how her editor would react, how quickly this clip would spread. She did not notice. As she turned to leave, the young man who had been standing just beyond the velvet ropes, close enough to hear every word. Daniel Cross was 35 years old, a stunt coordinator with a decade and a half of experience and a reputation for precision and safety. He had grown up watching Steven Seagal's films, had idolized the man, had even worked on one of Seagal's direct-to-video projects years ago. Tonight, he had come hoping to meet his hero again, perhaps exchange a few words, maybe even ask for advice. But standing there, listening to the dismissive arrogance in Seagal's voice, something inside Daniel shifted. It was not anger. Not exactly. It was closer to disappointment. The kind that settles in the chest like a stone. Within 20 minutes. The clip was online. Sarah had uploaded it from her phone while still standing in the hall. her editor already texting back with urgent approval. The soundbite, stripped of context and reduced to its most inflammatory essence, spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Fight commentators picked it up. Film critics weighed in. By the time the evening's second honorary speech began, the entire convention center was buzzing with it. The master of ceremonies, a veteran character actor with a gift for reading the room, could not resist. As he took the stage to introduce the next segment, he leaned into the microphone with a grin that was equal parts mischief and showmanship. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the sound system, "tonight we are honored to have with us a man who brought the art of Aikido to the silver screen. Please welcome Steven Seagal." The applause was polite but measured. Seagal acknowledged it with a nod, his expression unchanged. The MC continued, his tone shifting, building anticipation. "And later this evening, we will be joined by a true icon of American cinema, a man whose work as a director and actor has defined the Western genre for generations, the legendary Clint Eastwood." The applause that followed was thunderous. It rolled through the hall in waves, genuine and unrestrained. People rose to their feet. Daniel Cross, still standing near the VIP section, watched as Seagal's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest of his chair. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The room had spoken, and its verdict was clear. The hum of conversation in the Monterey Convention Center shifted when Clint Eastwood arrived. There was no fanfare, no dramatic entrance orchestrated for maximum effect. He simply appeared at the edge of the main hall, moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who had stopped seeking approval decades ago. He wore a faded denim shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and dark jeans that had seen years of honest wear. His boots were leather, scuffed at the toes, the kind a working man might choose for comfort rather than style. There was no entourage trailing behind him, no publicist whispering urgent reminders into his ear. Just Clint Eastwood, 84 years old, his face lined with the geography of a long and uncompromising life, his eyes still sharp beneath heavy brows. People noticed. The change in the room's energy was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd like wind across tall grass. Directors nodded respectfully as he passed. Stunt coordinators straightened their postures, some offering brief handshakes that Clint accepted with quiet courtesy. There was no fawning, no desperation in these exchanges. Only respect, the kind that is earned through decades of work that speaks louder than words ever could. Daniel Cross watched from his position near the bar, a glass of water forgotten in his hand. He had worked on 2 of Eastwood's films as a stunt coordinator, small roles in large productions, but the experience had left an impression. Clint treated his stunt teams with the same consideration he gave his lead actors. He listened when they spoke about safety concerns. He trusted their expertise. Daniel remembered a moment on set when a younger stunt performer had made a mistake during a complex fall, landing awkwardly and limping off camera. Clint had stopped filming immediately, walked over to check on the young man himself, and then spent 10 minutes discussing how to adjust the shot to make it safer. No anger, no impatience, just problem solving. That memory felt particularly vivid now. Standing in this hall, knowing what Seagal had said just minutes earlier, Clint made his way toward the stage area, pausing occasionally to exchange brief words with people he recognized. His movements were economical, deliberate. There was no wasted motion, no performative gestures designed to draw attention. When he reached the front section, he accepted a chair that was offered and sat down with the same quiet grace, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He did not look around to see who was watching. He simply waited, present but undemanding. The master of ceremonies, sensing the moment had arrived, returned to the microphone with renewed energy. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing attention on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC began, his voice carrying through the sound system with practiced clarity. It is my great privilege tonight to welcome a true icon of American cinema. A man whose work as both director and actor has defined generations. A filmmaker who understands that real drama comes not from spectacle, but from truth. Please join me in welcoming Clint Eastwood. The applause was immediate and overwhelming. It crashed through the hall in waves, genuine and sustained. People rose from their seats, not because protocol demanded it, but because something in them wanted to. Daniel found himself standing as well, clapping until his palms stung. Even those who had never worked with Clint, who knew him only through his films, seemed to understand that they were in the presence of something rare. Authenticity. The real thing. Clint stood slowly, acknowledged the applause with a slight nod, and made his way to the microphone. He did not smile for the cameras, did not raise his hands in triumph. He simply stood there, waiting for the noise to subside, his expression neutral but not cold. When the room finally quieted, he leaned toward the microphone and spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of years spent speaking only when he had something worth saying. "I appreciate the kind words, but let's be honest. I'm just a guy who's been lucky enough to work with talented people for a long time. The real artists are the stunt coordinators, the camera operators, the editors who make the rest of us look good. They're the ones who deserve this applause." It was a brief speech, characteristically modest, and the room responded with another round of genuine appreciation. Clint nodded once more and turned to leave the stage. But the MC, who had been following the social media explosion for the past hour, could not resist the opportunity to stir the pot. "Mr. Eastwood," the MC called out, his tone shifting to something more playful, more provocative. "Before you go, I wonder if I might ask you a quick question. There's been some discussion tonight about the nature of real combat versus cinematic combat. Some have suggested that film work, even the legendary westerns you've directed, doesn't reflect genuine martial arts expertise. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that." The room fell silent. It was the kind of silence that has texture, that presses against the skin. Everyone understood what was happening. The MC was referencing Seagal's comments, throwing gasoline on a fire that was already spreading online. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This was not going to end well. Clint paused, his hand resting on the back of a chair. He did not turn immediately. When he finally looked back at the MC, his expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had sharpened. "I think," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that respect is earned, not declared. A man who knows what he's capable of doesn't need to tell everyone about it. He just does the work." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. It hung in the air like a verdict, quiet but final. Several people in the audience glanced toward the VIP section where Seagal sat, but Clint did not follow their gaze. He had said what he needed to say. He was done, but Steven Seagal was not done. Daniel saw him rise from his seat, his movements sharp and deliberate, the carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Seagal stepped over the velvet rope and moved toward the stage with purpose. His jaw was set, his hands curled into loose fists at his sides. This was not the serene martial arts master from the films. This was a man who had been challenged in public, whose authority had been questioned, and who could not let it stand. "Mr. Eastwood," Seagal called out, his voice cutting through the murmur that had begun to spread through the crowd. With all due respect, I think you're confusing filmmaking with actual combat knowledge. I've trained special forces operatives. I've studied with masters in Japan. I understand real-world violence in ways that most people in this room, yourself included, could never comprehend. Clint turned fully now, facing Seagal for the first time. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in the way he stood, the stillness of his posture, that suggested he was weighing the man before him with considerable care. "Is that right?" he said. It was not a question. Seagal continued, his voice rising slightly, playing now to the cameras that had swiveled to capture every moment. "I'm willing to prove it. Right here. Right now. Not some choreographed movie fight, but a real demonstration. Let's see who actually understands combat." The crowd stirred. This was unprecedented. Galas like this were meant to be celebrations, carefully scripted events where everyone played their assigned roles and went home satisfied. What Seagal was proposing, a public confrontation in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras, violated every unspoken rule of Hollywood decorum. Clint studied Seagal for a long moment, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm 84 years old," he said. "I direct movies. I don't claim to be a fighter. Never have. But if you need to prove something to yourself, I can arrange a test. Not some theatrical demonstration. Something real. Something that shows whether you understand actual combat or just the idea of it." Seagal's eyes narrowed behind his dark glasses. "What are you suggesting?" Clint gestured toward a section of the crowd where several stunt coordinators stood watching the exchange with obvious interest. "Real-world pressure scenarios," he said. "The kind of situations that don't wait for perfect form or elegant technique, reflexes under stress, decision-making when things go wrong. The stuff that separates people who talk about combat from people who understand it." He paused. "And since I'm not foolish enough to pretend I'm qualified to participate, I'll send someone who is, someone who's spent 20 years learning what actually works when everything's on the line." From the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and solid, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that bore the quiet scars of a life spent testing limits. His movements were efficient, controlled, the gait of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. He wore a simple dark shirt and jeans. No flash, no performance. Daniel recognized him immediately. Jack Reeves, former Navy SEAL, one of the most respected stunt coordinators in the industry, a man who had worked with Clint Eastwood on 15 different films and had earned a reputation for being both exceptionally skilled and absolutely honest about what did and did not work in real situations. Jack stopped beside Clint, his expression calm, almost bored. He did not look at Seagal directly, but there was no disrespect in the omission. He was simply waiting, conserving energy, the way a professional does before work begins. Clint nodded toward Jack. "This is Jack Reeves. He'll run the scenarios with you. Same conditions for both of you. A panel of experts will evaluate. No choreography, no rehearsal. Just honest assessment of who understands real combat and who's been playing pretend." The challenge hung in the air, stark and unavoidable. Seagal's face flushed slightly beneath his tan. He had painted himself into a corner with his own words, his own pride. To refuse now would be to admit that his confidence had been nothing but performance. To accept was to risk public humiliation. But ego is a cruel master. and Steven Seagal had spent too many years building the myth of his invincibility to walk away. "I accept," Seagal said, his voice tight. "Let's do this properly. Get your panel together. Set up your scenarios. We'll see who's been playing pretend." The crowd erupted into urgent conversation. Cameras flashed. Phones were raised to capture video. Sarah Brennan, still standing near the press area, felt her heart racing. This was no longer just a story about Hollywood legends trading barbs. This was something else entirely. Something that was going to define careers, reputations, legacies. She glanced at Daniel Cross and saw her own shock reflected in his face. The young stunt coordinator looked like a man watching his world shift on its axis, uncertain whether the ground beneath him would hold. Within 30 minutes, the convention center staff had cleared the main exhibition floor and set up 3 distinct testing areas. The panel of experts assembled quickly, drawn by curiosity and professional interest. 3 veteran stunt coordinators who had worked in the industry for a combined 90 years. A former Special Forces operator who now consulted on military films. A mixed martial arts coach whose fighters had won championships. They sat at a long table with scoring sheets before them, their expressions serious. This was not entertainment to them. This was an assessment of fundamental skills, and they would treat it with the gravity it deserved. The crowd pressed close to the barriers that had been erected to keep the testing areas clear. The energy in the room had transformed completely. The celebratory atmosphere was gone, replaced by something sharp and anticipatory. Daniel stood at the front, his hands gripping the barrier rail, unable to look away. Part of him still hoped this was some elaborate performance, that Seagal would reveal himself to be as skilled as he claimed. But another part, the part that had listened to that dismissive arrogance earlier, already knew how this was going to end. Clint Eastwood stood off to the side, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his expression unchanged. He was not gloating, not anticipating victory. He simply watched. The way a man watches a problem unfold according to predictable laws. Beside him, Jack Reeves rolled his shoulders once, a small gesture of preparation, then went still again. He looked like a man about to do a job he had done 1,000 times before. Competent, unremarkable, absolutely certain. Steven Seagal stood in the first testing area, his black silk jacket removed now, revealing a fitted black shirt beneath. He stretched his arms, rolled his neck, went through a brief series of movements that looked impressive to the untrained eye. Aikido forms, flowing and circular, elegant in their precision. The cameras loved it. But Daniel, watching from his position at the barrier, noticed something. Seagal was performing again. Even now, playing to the audience. And in the moment before the first test began, Daniel saw something flicker across Seagal's face. Just for an instant, before the mask of confidence reasserted itself. It looked like doubt. The first testing area had been set up with deliberate simplicity. A marked circle on the polished floor, approximately 20 feet in diameter. No props, no theatrical lighting, just open space and the kind of fluorescent overhead illumination that stripped away shadows and left nowhere to hide. A young stunt performer, chosen for his ability to execute controlled attacks without causing actual injury, stood to one side, rolling his shoulders and checking his footing. He wore padded protective gear beneath street clothes, a rubber training knife tucked into his belt. His instructions had been clear. Attack from behind or the side, without warning, with committed intent. Make it real enough to trigger genuine reflexes. The panel of 5 experts sat at their table 15 feet away. Clipboards ready. Expressions neutrales. They had seen thousands of techniques over their combined decades in the industry. They would know the difference between rehearsed movement and authentic response. Jack Reeves stepped into the circle first. He stood in the center, hands loose at his sides, weight distributed evenly. His breathing was steady, unhurried. He did not scan the room or telegraph awareness. He simply existed in the space, present but not tense, the way a man waits for a bus or stands in line at a coffee shop. There was nothing martial about his posture, nothing that suggested readiness. To the untrained eye, he looked vulnerable, almost careless. But Daniel Cross, watching from the barrier, recognized what he was seeing. Jack was not trying to appear ready. He was ready. The difference was everything. The room held its collective breath. The attacker moved, suddenly and with purpose, closing the distance from Jack's left side in 3 quick steps. The rubber knife came up in a rising thrust toward the ribs. The kind of attack that in a real situation would be over before the victim knew what was happening. Jack's response was so economical it almost seemed like no response at all. His body shifted, just inches, weight transferring to his back foot. His left hand swept down and across, intercepting the attacker's wrist with his forearm, deflecting the trajectory of the blade. His right hand came up simultaneously, palm striking the attacker's elbow, collapsing the joint. The attacker's momentum carried him forward into empty space as Jack sidestepped, pivoting on his back foot. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. The attacker stumbled, caught himself, looked back with something like respect in his eyes. Jack remained where he had ended up, his breathing unchanged, his expression calm. He did not celebrate, did not acknowledge the murmurs from the crowd. He simply returned to a neutral stance and waited for the next instruction. The panel members were writing notes, exchanging brief glances. One of them, a stunt coordinator with 40 years of experience, nodded slowly. It was the kind of nod that communicated volumes without words. Steven Seagal stepped into the circle next. He moved differently than Jack had, with visible purpose and deliberate grace. He positioned himself in the center, then adjusted his stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. His hands came up into a ready position, fingers spread, as though preparing to receive an attack he knew was coming. It was a martial arts stance, recognizable to anyone who had studied combat sports. It was also, Daniel realized with a sinking feeling, a mistake. The entire point of this test was to evaluate natural reflexes under surprise conditions. By adopting a ready stance, Seagal was telegraphing his awareness, transforming a test of genuine reaction into a choreographed demonstration. The attacker approached from behind, moving quickly but not silently. Seagal began to turn before the attack fully developed, his body rotating with the flowing circular motion characteristic of Aikido. His hands reached for the attacker's wrist as the rubber knife came forward. What should have been a simple deflection became something more complex. Seagal attempted to capture the wrist, rotate it, apply a lock that would force the attacker to the ground. It was elegant in theory, beautiful in the way traditional martial arts techniques can be beautiful. But it was also slow. The attacker's knife hand moved past Seagal's initial attempt at control. By the time Seagal managed to secure the grip and begin the rotation, 7 full seconds had elapsed. In those 7 seconds, the attacker had delivered 2 simulated strikes to Seagal's torso. When Seagal finally completed the technique and the attacker tapped out from the wrist lock, there was silence. It was not the impressed silence that had followed Jack's response. It was the uncomfortable silence of people witnessing something they had hoped not to see. Seagal released the attacker and straightened, adjusting his shirt. His face was flushed, Whether from exertion or embarrassment, it was impossible to tell behind the dark glasses he still wore. The former Special Forces operator on the panel, a man named Marcus Webb who had seen combat in 3 different theaters, leaned forward to speak into his microphone. His voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hall. "In a real situation," he said, his tone factual rather than judgmental, "you would have been stabbed twice before you established control. The technique itself was executed correctly. But the context was wrong. Speed matters. Simplicity matters. In reality, you'd be dead." Seagal's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to argue, to explain that in a true combat situation, he would have responded differently, that the test parameters were artificial, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He stepped out of the circle without speaking. The second testing area involved a weapon disarm. A single attacker stood 10 feet away, holding what appeared to be a realistic replica handgun. The gun was inert, mechanically incapable of firing, but equipped with sensors that would register if the trigger was pulled. The scenario was straightforward. The armed individual was stationary, weapon aimed at center mass. The objective was to close the distance, disarm the threat, and secure the weapon without allowing it to discharge. It was a situation that law enforcement and military personnel trained for extensively, and one that had no room for error. In the real world, hesitation meant death. Overconfidence meant death. Only precise, practiced movement executed with absolute commitment offered any chance of success. Jack Reeves studied the setup for a moment, his eyes moving from the gun to the attacker's stance to the space between them. He did not rush. When he moved, it was with sudden explosive speed, closing the 10 feet in less than a second. His hand came up as he moved, fingers extended, striking the side of the gun's barrel with his palm and deflecting it away from his center line. His other hand simultaneously grabbed the attacker's wrist, controlling it. His body pressed in close, trapping the weapon between them as he twisted the gun backward, away from the attacker's natural grip strength. The entire disarm took 1.5 seconds. The gun came free without the trigger sensor registering. Jack secured it, stepped back, cleared the imaginary chamber, and set it down on the ground. His breathing had increased slightly, but his hands were steady. The panel members conferred quietly, making notes. The mixed martial arts coach, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, whose students had competed at the highest levels, spoke into her microphone. "That was textbook," she said simply. "No wasted movement, proper angles, immediate control. That's what effective disarmament looks like." Seagal approached the second testing area with visible tension in his shoulders. He took his position, studied the armed attacker for several long seconds, then began to move. His approach was different from Jack's. He advanced more slowly, hands extended in front of him in a placating gesture, as though attempting to negotiate. When he finally committed to the disarm, his technique was again complex and circular. He stepped to the outside of the weapon, attempted to trap the attacker's wrist, then rotated his body to apply a joint lock while simultaneously reaching for the gun. It was intricate, potentially effective if executed with perfect timing, but the timing was not perfect. The gun's trigger sensor registered twice as Seagal worked to establish control. When he finally secured the weapon and stepped back, his breathing was heavy, his face showing clear frustration. The panel was silent for a moment. Then Marcus Webb spoke again, his voice carrying the same neutral tone. "The weapon discharged twice. In a real scenario, the first shot would likely have been fatal. The technique you attempted requires cooperative resistance to work properly. Against someone genuinely trying to hurt you, It leaves too many openings. Seagal's response was sharp, defensive. In actual combat, the attacker would be more committed. The fear factor changes everything. This controlled environment doesn't replicate real violence. Elena Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression patient but firm. Respectfully, "Mr. Fast, Seagal, that argument works both ways. In actual combat, you would also be experiencing fear, adrenaline, degraded fine motor skills. The simpler technique succeeds because it doesn't rely on perfect conditions. What we just saw was beautiful choreography. Wrong tool for the job." The third and final testing area was the most complex. The convention center staff had constructed a narrow corridor using portable walls and equipment cases, creating a confined space approximately 15 feet long and 6 feet wide. Dim lighting had been installed to simulate poor visibility. 2 attackers waited inside, positioned to create overlapping threats. A mannequin representing a civilian was positioned near the far end. The scenario parameters were clear. Navigate the confined space. Neutralize both threats. Protect the civilian. Complete the objective within 20 seconds. It was designed to test not just physical technique but decision-making under pressure, spatial awareness, prioritization of threats, and the ability to function when sensory input was degraded. Jack Reeves paused at the entrance to the corridor, taking 3 seconds to assess what he could see from his position. Then he entered, moving with purpose but not recklessness. The first attacker emerged from the left side, throwing a wide hook punch. Jack did not try to block or counter with elaborate technique. He simply stepped inside the arc of the punch, drove his shoulder into the attacker's chest, and used his momentum to pin the man against the wall. His elbow came up once, a short controlled strike to the side of the head, and the attacker signaled submission. Jack immediately pivoted toward the second threat, saw the mannequin in peripheral vision, adjusted his angle to keep his body between the civilian and the remaining attacker. The second attacker came forward aggressively. Jack met him with a straight punch to the solar plexus, followed immediately by a leg sweep. The attacker went down hard. Jack checked the mannequin, confirmed it was secure, then exited the corridor. Total time, 11 seconds. The crowd erupted in applause. It was impossible not to appreciate the efficiency, the clarity of thought under pressure, the complete absence of wasted motion. Jack acknowledged the response with a slight nod, then moved to stand beside Clint Eastwood, who had been watching the entire sequence with his characteristic stillness. Clint placed a hand briefly on Jack's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement, then removed it. No words were necessary. Steven Seagal stood at the entrance to the corridor for longer than Jack had, perhaps trying to formulate a plan, perhaps gathering courage. When he entered, his movements were immediately less certain. The confined space seemed to affect him, the low light causing visible hesitation. When the first attacker appeared, Seagal attempted another Aikido technique, reaching for the wrist, trying to redirect the energy of the punch. But in the tight quarters, there was no room for the circular movements that defined his art. His elbow struck the wall. The attacker's punch grazed his shoulder. Seagal pushed forward, finally managing to get past the first threat. But in doing so, he turned his back on the mannequin. The second attacker came at him from an unexpected angle. Seagal spun, lost his footing slightly on a cable that ran along the floor, caught himself against the wall. By the time he regained his balance and neutralized the second threat with a hasty tackle, 23 seconds had elapsed. The mannequin had been knocked over in the confusion, representing a failed objective. When Seagal emerged from the corridor, his hair was disheveled, his breathing ragged. There was a wildness in his eyes now, the look of a man whose reality was crumbling in real time. He did not look at the panel. He did not look at the crowd. He stared at the ground, his chest heaving. The panel members conferred briefly, their conversation too quiet for the audience to hear. Then the senior stunt coordinator, a man named Thomas Whitmore, who had worked on over 200 films, stood and approached the microphone. His expression was kind but unyielding, the look of someone who has to deliver bad news and will not soften it out of false mercy. "We've completed our evaluation," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. Mr. Reeves demonstrated reflexes, decision-making, and technical execution consistent with extensive real-world training. His responses prioritized effectiveness over aesthetics. Time to neutralization was minimal. Civilian safety was maintained. His score across all 3 scenarios is 94 out of 100 possible points. He paused, allowing the number to settle. Then he continued. Mr. Seagal demonstrated proficiency in traditional martial arts techniques. However, the execution showed consistent issues with timing, spatial awareness, and adaptation to non-cooperative resistance. In all 3 scenarios, the techniques chosen were inappropriate for the context. Time to neutralization exceeded acceptable parameters. Civilian safety was compromised. His score across all 3 scenarios is 31 out of 100. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels like weight, like pressure against the eardrums. Daniel Cross found that he could not look away from Seagal's face, could not stop watching the mask of confidence crack and crumble. This was not just defeat. This was exposure. The revelation of a gap between perception and reality so vast that bridging it seemed impossible. Clint Eastwood stepped forward, moving with the same unhurried pace that characterized all his actions. He did not go to the microphone. He simply positioned himself where both Seagal and the crowd could hear him clearly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but in the stillness it carried to every corner of the hall. Martial arts isn't about looking good, Clint said, each word deliberate and final. It's about staying alive. You failed tonight because you've been training for cameras instead of reality. Real combat doesn't wait for you to finish your technique. It punishes hesitation. It exposes fantasy. He turned slightly, addressing the crowd now rather than Seagal directly. There's no shame in not being a fighter. I'm not one. Never claimed to be. But there's considerable shame in building a career on a lie, in convincing people you possess skills you don't have, in disrespecting those who actually do the work. Clint's eyes moved back to Seagal, and there was something in that gaze that Daniel had seen before in the director's films. A kind of moral clarity, unyielding and absolute. You could have been honest. Clint said, you could have said, I'm an actor who studied martial arts. Nobody would have faulted you for that. But you chose arrogance over truth. And now everyone knows. With that, Clint turned and walked away, Jack Reeves falling into step beside him. They did not look back. The crowd parted for them, and the sound of their boots on the polished floor was the only noise in the entire hall. Steven Seagal stood alone in the testing area, surrounded by equipment and barriers and the physical evidence of his failure. His hands were trembling slightly. He opened his mouth as though to speak, to defend himself, to explain, but no words came. The former Special Forces operator, Marcus Webb, stood from the panel table and approached. His expression was not unkind, but neither was it sympathetic. Mr. Battle, Seagal, Marcus said quietly. His voice meant only for the 2 of them, though several people standing nearby could hear. I've been in actual combat. I've seen people die because they believed they were prepared when they weren't. What you demonstrated tonight, that gets people killed, not just yourself, but anyone relying on you." He paused, seemed to consider his next words carefully. "You're not a fraud because you're not the best fighter in the world. You're a fraud because you've spent decades claiming expertise you never actually tested. That's not just dishonest. It's dangerous." Marcus walked away, leaving Seagal standing there, isolated in a room full of hundreds of people. The cameras were still rolling. The phones were still recording. In living rooms and offices across the country, people were already watching the clips, sharing them, adding their commentary. The hashtags would be trending within the hour. The memes would be merciless. The career that Steven Seagal had spent 45 years constructing was disintegrating in real time. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Daniel Cross watched from his position at the barrier as Seagal finally moved, walking stiffly toward the exit, his shoulders hunched, his head down. People stepped aside to let him pass. But there was no sympathy in the gesture. It was simply expedience, the natural human instinct to move away from wreckage. Sarah Brennan stood near the press area, her recorder still running, her expression complex. She had started this chain of events with a simple interview. Now she was witnessing its conclusion, and the weight of that seemed to settle on her like a physical burden. As Seagal disappeared through the exit, the hall began to come alive again. Conversations resumed, tentative at first, then growing in volume. People pulled out phones, started texting, calling colleagues who had not been present. The panel members were packing up their materials, speaking in low tones. Jack Reeves had already left with Clint, their work finished. No interest in remaining for the aftermath. The convention center staff began dismantling the testing areas, returning the space to its original configuration. But the real work, Daniel knew, was just beginning. The internet would not be kind. The martial arts community would have opinions, fierce and divided. Seagal's defenders would call the test unfair, rigged, designed to humiliate. His critics would say it was long overdue, that the truth had finally caught up with years of exaggeration and bravado. The arguments would rage for weeks, maybe months, but underneath all the noise, one fact would remain undeniable. Steven Seagal had been given the opportunity to prove his claims in front of experts and witnesses, and he had failed, not partially, not with conditions and caveats, completely. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the Monterey Convention Center, and the world had not been kind to Steven Seagal. The videos had spread with the merciless efficiency of wildfire, jumping from platform to platform, accumulating millions of views within the first 72 hours. News outlets picked up the story. Entertainment blogs dissected every moment. Martial arts forums exploded with commentary, some sympathetic, most not. The consensus was brutal and nearly universal. Steven Seagal had been exposed, not by enemies or conspiracy, but by simple, undeniable truth. He had claimed expertise he did not possess, and when given the opportunity to prove himself under fair conditions, he had failed completely. The professional consequences arrived swiftly. A film deal that had been in negotiation for 8 months collapsed within days. The production company issuing a terse statement about creative differences. A seminar tour that was scheduled to visit 12 cities across the country was canceled. The organizers citing concerns about safety protocols, but everyone understanding the real reason. Students began leaving his dojo in steady numbers, some requesting refunds, others simply disappearing without explanation. The few who remained were mostly older practitioners, people who had invested too much time and money to walk away easily. But even their loyalty seemed strained, fragile. Seagal retreated from public view entirely. He canceled all scheduled appearances, stopped responding to interview requests, deleted his social media accounts after they became overrun with mockery and criticism. His publicist released a single statement suggesting that the testing conditions had been unfair and that Mr. Seagal would be taking time to focus on personal training before making any further public appearances. The statement convinced no one. It read like the last gasp of a drowning reputation, and the internet treated it accordingly. Daniel Cross had watched the aftermath unfold with a mixture of emotions he struggled to name. There was vindication, certainly. He had sensed something false in Seagal's confidence that night, and events had proven his instincts correct. But there was also sadness, a kind of mourning for the hero he had believed in as a younger man. The realization that someone he had admired was built on nothing more substantial than image and bravado felt like a small death, the loss of something he had not known he valued until it was gone. He thought about reaching out, considered sending a message through mutual contacts, some expression of concern or offer of assistance. But what would he say? What comfort could he offer to a man whose entire identity had been dismantled in front of the world? In the end, Daniel did nothing, and the silence felt like cowardice, though he could not say what the brave choice would have been. It was late afternoon when Daniel finally decided to act. He had finished a job on a film set in Burbank, a straightforward stunt sequence involving a car crash that had gone smoothly enough to wrap early. As he packed his equipment into his truck, his phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had posted new footage from the convention center night, a different angle showing Seagal's face more clearly during the third test. The moment when realization seemed to hit him. Daniel watched the clip once, felt his stomach turn, and closed the app. He sat in his truck for several minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Then he pulled out his phone again and searched for Seagal's last known address. The drive to San Jose took just under 2 hours. Daniel spent most of it second-guessing the decision, rehearsing opening lines that all sounded hollow in his head. What was he hoping to accomplish? Did he think he could offer wisdom to a man who had spent 45 years convinced of his own superiority? The questions circled without answers. But he kept driving. Some part of him needed to see Steven Seagal as a human being rather than a meme. A cautionary tale. A trending topic. Some part of him needed to understand how a person survives the complete destruction of their self-image. The apartment complex was modest, a 2-story structure painted in faded beige with external staircases and small balconies cluttered with bicycles and potted plants. It was the kind of place where people lived temporarily, between better situations, or permanently because better situations never materialized. Daniel checked the address twice, unable to reconcile this ordinary building with the man who had once commanded 7-figure salaries and lived in houses photographed for magazines. But the number matched, and there was Seagal's black Mercedes parked in a numbered spot, looking out of place among the practical sedans and aging pickup trucks. Daniel climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor and found apartment 214. He stood outside the door for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of a television playing inside. Voices speaking in Japanese. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated, then knocked anyway. 3 firm raps that sounded too loud in the quiet hallway. The television went silent. Footsteps approached, heavy and slow. The door opened 6 inches, stopped by a security chain, and Steven Seagal peered through the gap. Daniel barely recognized him. The dark glasses were gone, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. The silver hair, usually so meticulously maintained, hung loose and unwashed past his shoulders. His face was covered with several days of gray stubble, and he wore a stained white undershirt and sweatpants. He looked like what he was, A man in free fall. Someone who had stopped caring about the image because the image no longer mattered. What do you want? Seagal's voice was hoarse, as though he had not spoken aloud in days. Mr. Minnie Brown. Seagal. I'm Daniel Cross. I worked with you on that direct-to-video project about 5 years ago. I was also at the convention center. I saw what happened. Seagal's expression did not change. Everyone saw what happened. It's been viewed 12 million times. Did you come here to gloat? No. Seer. I came because I wanted to talk. If you'll let me. For a long moment, Seagal just stared at him, and Daniel thought he was about to slam the door. Then, unexpectedly, the chain rattled and the door swung open. Seagal stepped back without a word. A gesture that was not quite invitation but also not refusal. Daniel entered. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished. A couch. A television on a cheap stand. A small dining table with one chair. Empty bottles cluttered the kitchen counter. Not alcohol, but energy drinks and bottled water. As though Seagal had been trying to sustain himself without actual food. The blinds were drawn, keeping the space dim despite the afternoon sun outside. It smelled stale, like a place where air had not circulated properly for weeks. Seagal moved to the couch and sat down heavily. His movements, those of a much older man. He did not invite Daniel to sit. So Daniel remained standing, feeling awkward and intrusive. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and heavy. Why did you accept the challenge? Daniel asked finally. Because it was the question he had been carrying since that night. You had to know it wasn't going to end well. Seagal laughed, a sound without humor. Did I? You think I knew I was a fraud all along? That I was consciously lying to everyone for decades? He shook his head. I believed it. Daniel. That's the thing nobody understands. I believed every word I said. 45 years of being told I was a master. Of having people bow when I walked into a room. Of never being challenged by anyone who could actually test me. You start to think it's real. You start to think you're invincible. But you must have had doubts. Some moment when you wondered if... No. Seagal cut him off. His voice sharp. That's the trap. The longer you go without testing yourself, the easier it becomes to assume you don't need to. I surrounded myself with students who wanted to believe. I chose training partners who would cooperate. Every demonstration, every seminar, every film, they all reinforced the story I was telling. And the story felt true because nobody contradicted it. Not until that night. Daniel moved slowly to the dining table and pulled out the single chair. Turning it to face the couch, he sat down, keeping his posture open. Non-threatening. What happened with your training? You did study Aikido. Didn't you? For years. In Japan. With legitimate instructors. I earned my black belt honestly. The techniques I learned, they work. In the right context, with the right parameters. Seagal gestured vaguely at nothing. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what those parameters were. I stopped questioning when a technique would fail, what its limitations were. I just assumed that because it worked with cooperative partners in controlled settings, it would work everywhere. And because I never put myself in situations where I'd be proven wrong. I never learned better. The Special Forces training you talked about? Bullshit. The word came out flat. Final. I consulted on a couple of films where military advisors were present. I showed some Aikido principles to guys who were being polite. I convinced myself that made me a combat expert. I confused proximity to real warriors with being a warrior myself. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. A recognition of how thoroughly Seagal's self-deception had been constructed. Why didn't anyone tell you? Surely someone must have known. People did tell me. Or they tried to, but I had responses for everything. If someone suggested a technique wouldn't work against full resistance, I'd say they weren't doing it correctly. If someone questioned my claims about training special forces, I'd get offended and question their integrity. After a while, people stopped trying. It was easier to let me believe what I wanted to believe. Seagal leaned back against the couch, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not the humiliation. It's not the lost contracts or the students leaving or the internet making jokes. It's knowing that I could have been honest at any point. I could have said, I'm an actor who studied Aikido and I love the art, but I've never tested it against real violence. Nobody would have hated me for that, but I couldn't do it. My ego wouldn't let me be just good at something. I had to be the best. Untouchable. A master. Daniel chose his next words carefully. Mr. Seagal, failing doesn't mean everything you learned was worthless. It just means you misunderstood what you had. Doesn't it? Seagal looked at him directly now. I've spent the last 3 weeks replaying every technique, every teaching, every claim I ever made, and I can't find a single piece of solid ground. It's all built on sand. All of it. That's not true. Aikido has value, but maybe not the value you thought it had. Maybe it's about discipline, about philosophy, about movement principles. Maybe it was never supposed to be about winning fights. Then what good is it? Seagal's voice cracked slightly. What's the point of martial arts if they don't make you able to protect yourself? Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mr. Seagal, I've worked with some of the best fighters in the world. MMA champions, stunt coordinators who've been in actual combat. People like Jack Reeves. You know what they all have in common? They know their limits. They train honestly, test themselves constantly, and they're humble about what they don't know. That's the difference. Not the techniques, the honesty. So I should just admit I wasted 45 years? No. You should admit you spent 45 years learning something valuable, and then you spent them teaching it wrong. There's a difference. Daniel paused. And you should admit that you can start over. Not as the untouchable master, as someone who actually wants to learn what works. Seagal was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If I admit everything, if I acknowledge publicly that I was wrong about all of it, I lose what little I have left. The few students who stayed, the small chance of ever working again. It all disappears. Maybe, Daniel acknowledged, or maybe you build something real for the first time. Something that doesn't require lies to sustain. But that's your choice to make, not mine. They sat in silence after that, the weight of the conversation settling between them like sediment. Daniel had said what he came to say, though he was not sure it had made any difference. Seagal looked exhausted, hollowed out. A man who had used every reserve of energy just to maintain the facade for so long that there was nothing left now that it had collapsed. Finally, Daniel stood, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. He placed it on the small table beside the couch. If you decide you want to train honestly, not to prove anything to anyone, but just to understand what actually works, call me. I know people who would be willing to work with you. Not to humiliate you or fix you or anything like that, just to help you start over. Seagal picked up the card, turned it over in his fingers, but did not look at it. Why would you do that? After everything? Because I used to look up to you, Daniel said honestly, and I'd rather see you become someone worth looking up to for real than watch you disappear into bitterness. He moved toward the door, then paused. The martial arts world needs all its traditions. Mr. Seagal, even the ones that need updating. But they need honest practitioners more than they need legends. He let himself out, closing the door quietly behind him. As he descended the exterior stairs, he heard no sound from inside the apartment. No acknowledgement. No farewell. Just silence. Daniel got into his truck and sat there for several minutes, watching the light fade from the sky, wondering if anything he had said would matter. Probably not. People rarely changed in the ways others hoped they would, but at least he had tried. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it at a red light. It was from an unknown number. Just 4 words. Thank you for trying. Daniel did not respond. What could he say? He drove back toward Los Angeles as twilight deepened into night, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated, just tired and oddly sad for a man he had never really known. 3 days later, Daniel received another message from the same number. I'm not ready yet. That was all. Daniel typed a response, deleted it, typed another. Finally, he settled on something simple. The door is open when you're ready to walk through it with honesty. He sent it and put his phone away, uncertain if there would ever be a reply. There was not. The weeks turned into months, and Steven Seagal remained absent from public life, a ghost haunting the edges of martial arts forums and occasional tabloid speculation. Daniel moved on to other projects, other stunts, other concerns. But sometimes, late at night when he could not sleep, he would wonder about the man in that small apartment in San Jose, and whether he was still sitting in the dark, staring at a business card, unable to take the step that might lead to redemption or simply unwilling to try. 6 months after the night that had upended Steven Seagal's world, the aftermath had settled into something resembling permanence. The videos still circulated online, resurfacing periodically whenever someone discovered them anew or whenever the algorithm decided they were relevant again. They had become part of internet folklore, the kind of content that existed in perpetual archive, ready to be weaponized in arguments about authenticity, expertise, or the dangers of unchecked ego. Steven Seagal's name had transformed from a subject of debate into shorthand for self-delusion. A cautionary example invoked whenever someone claimed abilities they could not demonstrate. Clint Eastwood had returned to his work with characteristic steadiness, directing a new film about the invisible labor of stunt professionals, the men and women who risked their bodies to create the illusions that audiences consumed without thought. When asked about the incident during a press junket, his response was measured and final. I don't take pleasure in another man's fall, he told a journalist from Variety, his voice carrying that familiar gravel. But I won't apologize for honesty either. Everyone faces their mirror eventually. What they do after that moment, how they choose to respond to what they see, that defines them more than the mirror itself ever could. The reporter had pressed for more, asking if Eastwood felt any responsibility for what had happened to Seagal's career. Clint had looked at her with those pale eyes that had stared down outlaws and corrupt lawmen in dozens of films, and said simply, "A man doesn't need me to destroy himself. He just needs a stage and an audience willing to watch." I provided neither. He brought both. Jack Reeves had declined all interview requests following the event, returning immediately to his work on film sets where he remained what he had always been: competent, reliable, and uninterested in fame. When cornered by a persistent martial arts blogger outside a soundstage in Los Angeles, Jack had stopped, considered his words carefully, and offered only this: I did a job. I demonstrated what real preparation looks like. If that made someone else's lies visible, that's not my fault. I don't celebrate it, but I don't apologize for it either. Then he had walked away, and no amount of calling after him had brought him back. Daniel Cross found that his career had benefited unexpectedly from his peripheral involvement in the incident. Directors who had seen footage of the event recognized him in the background, standing at the barrier, watching with obvious investment. They interpreted his presence as evidence of professional integrity, someone who cared enough about the craft to witness its honest assessment. Job offers increased. His reputation for safety and precision, already solid, seemed to carry additional weight now. People trusted him in ways they had not before, as though proximity to truth had granted him some transferable credibility. He used that credibility to build something he had been contemplating for years. In a rented warehouse space in Glendale, Daniel opened a training facility focused exclusively on what he called reality-based defense. No uniforms, no belt rankings, no philosophical pretensions, just honest instruction in techniques that worked under pressure, taught by people who had tested them in contexts where failure had consequences. He brought in retired law enforcement, former military, MMA coaches who understood that sport fighting and survival were related but distinct disciplines. The classes were small, the standards high, the atmosphere serious without being oppressive. On the wall of the main training area, Daniel hung 2 photographs. The first showed Clint Eastwood on a film set, 70 years old at the time, listening intently to a stunt coordinator half his age explain the mechanics of a fall. The caption beneath read, "Respect is earned, not declared." The second photograph showed Jack Reeves demonstrating a disarm technique to a group of young stunt performers, his expression focused and patient. Its caption read, "Train hard, stay humble, fight honest." A young student, perhaps 19 years old and eager in the way that youth often is, had asked Daniel during the first week why there was no photograph of Steven Seagal, given that Daniel had studied under him years ago. The question was innocent, born of curiosity rather than malice. Daniel had looked at the empty space on the wall where a third photograph might have hung. Then back at the student. "I don't hang pictures of cautionary tales," Daniel had said quietly. "Seagal taught me something valuable, but he never intended to. He showed me that skill without character is worthless, that reputation without substance is just noise, that you can lie to the world for decades, but eventually, reality demands its accounting." He paused. "The best lesson he gave me was demonstrating what not to become. I don't need his picture on my wall to remember that." The student had nodded, seeming to understand, and the question had not come up again. Sarah Brennan had built her own career on the foundation of that viral interview, though not in the way she had initially imagined. The clip had indeed made her name recognizable in entertainment journalism circles, but she had quickly discovered that being known as the person who triggered someone's public destruction was not the kind of fame that felt comfortable. The comment sections had been vicious, split between those who praised her for asking tough questions and those who accused her of ambushing Seagal for clicks. The truth, as she saw it, was simpler and more mundane. She had asked a straightforward question and recorded an honest answer. What happened afterward was not her doing, though she could not quite shake the feeling of having been an instrument in someone's downfall. She spent 3 months researching and writing a long-form piece for Pacific Film and Arts Journal, published both in print and online, titled "The Man Who Believed His Own Myth, Steven Seagal and the Cost of Arrogance." It was neither a hit piece nor an apology. It was an attempt to understand how someone could spend 45 years constructing an identity built on claims that had never been tested, and what it meant when those claims finally collided with reality. She interviewed martial arts historians, psychologists who specialized in self-deception, former students who had left Seagal's dojo over the years. She reached out to Seagal himself multiple times, offering him the opportunity to tell his side. He never responded. The article was careful, thoughtful, and brutal in its conclusions. Seagal was not destroyed by Clint Eastwood. Sarah wrote in the piece's final section. He was not destroyed by Jack Reeves, by the panel of experts, or by the internet's gleeful mockery. He was destroyed by the simple introduction of accountability into a life that had been carefully constructed to avoid it. For decades, he chose students who would believe rather than question, partners who would cooperate rather than resist, venues where his authority would not be challenged. He built a fortress of yes men and favorable conditions, and when someone finally said, "Prove it," the fortress collapsed because there was nothing inside. The article won a regional journalism award and was widely shared across platforms. It became required reading in several film school ethics courses. Used as a case study about the responsibility of media figures and the danger of unchecked self-promotion, Sarah's career flourished, but she remained ambivalent about the foundation it was built on. Aware that her professional success was inextricably linked to another person's professional annihilation, Steven Seagal himself remained absent from public view. There were occasional, unconfirmed sightings, rumors that filtered through martial arts communities. Someone claimed to have seen him at a small Aikido dojo in rural Idaho, sitting in the back row of a class, watching but not participating. Another report placed him at a veterans support group meeting in Arizona, though the source was questionable and the details vague. A third rumor suggested he had started teaching private lessons again, working with a handful of students in a garage somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, but charging nothing and requiring that no one discuss his involvement. None of these stories could be verified, and none of them cohered into a clear picture of what Seagal's life had become. What was known was that he had abandoned all social media, discontinued his official website, and allowed his public presence to evaporate almost completely. The few times his name appeared in martial arts forums, it was either as a punchline or as an object lesson, and the discussions rarely lasted long. People moved on. The internet's attention span was short, and there were always new scandals, new revelations, new targets for collective judgment. Steven Seagal faded from relevance not dramatically but gradually, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. On a cool October evening, nearly 8 months after the Monterey Convention Center event, Daniel received an email from an address he did not recognize. The subject line read simply, "From an old student." The message itself was brief. "Mr. Cross, you don't know me, but I studied under Steven Seagal for 6 years before leaving his school 3 years ago. I heard about what you did, visiting him after everything happened. I wanted you to know that I tried to do the same thing last month. I found where he's living now. A small town in Montana. I knocked on his door. He answered, and I could see he recognized me. But he said he wasn't teaching anymore and had nothing to offer. I told him I wasn't looking for a teacher. Just wanted to check on him as a human being. He thanked me for coming and closed the door. I stood there for a while, hoping he'd change his mind. But he didn't come back. I don't know if this information helps you or means anything, but I thought you should know. Some of us tried. He's just not ready to accept help. Maybe not from anyone. Maybe not ever." Daniel read the email twice, then closed his laptop without responding. What was there to say? The man had made his choices, was still making them apparently, and those choices led toward isolation rather than reconstruction. It was sad in a distant way, like hearing about a natural disaster in a country you had never visited. Regrettable, but not personal. Not anymore. In his training facility the next morning, Daniel taught a class on defensive tactics against multiple attackers. He emphasized situational awareness, prioritization of threats, and the acceptance that some scenarios had no winning outcome, only better and worse ways to lose. His students, ranging from film industry professionals to ordinary people who simply wanted to feel more capable, listened with the kind of attention that Daniel had learned to value. They were not looking for magic techniques or secret knowledge. They wanted practical tools, honestly presented, and they trusted him to provide them because he had demonstrated that he valued truth over theater. During a water break, one of the students, a woman in her early 30s who worked as a camera operator, approached Daniel with a question. Do you think Seagal could have recovered from what happened? Like, if he had handled it differently, apologized publicly, started training honestly? Daniel considered the question seriously. Maybe, he said finally. But recovery would have required him to become a completely different person. To admit not just that he was wrong about some things, but that his entire identity was built on deception. That's not a small ask. Most people can't do that. They'd rather disappear than transform. That seems like a waste. The woman said, 45 years of experience. Even if it was misguided, that still has value, doesn't it? It would have value if he was willing to recontextualize it. To say, here's what I learned. Here's where I was wrong. Here's what actually works. But that requires a kind of humility that Seagal never demonstrated. And without that humility, the experience is worthless. It's just reinforced delusion. Daniel took a drink from his water bottle. The saddest part is that people would have respected him for honesty. The martial arts community values integrity over perfection. He could have had a second act. He chose not to. The class resumed, and the conversation ended. But Daniel found himself thinking about it for the rest of the day. That evening, alone in his apartment, he pulled up one of the original videos from the convention center. Something he had avoided doing for months. He watched Seagal's face during the final test. Saw the moment when confidence gave way to confusion. Confusion to desperation. Desperation to defeat. It was difficult to watch. Even now. Not because it was brutal or violent, but because it was so thoroughly, irrevocably final. The death of an illusion. Captured in high definition. Viewed millions of times. Impossible to undo or recontextualize. Daniel closed the video and sat in silence for a while. Then he opened a new document and began writing. Not for publication, but for clarity. He titled it, Lessons from a Fallen Master, and spent the next 2 hours articulating everything he had learned from Steven Seagal's rise and catastrophic fall. He wrote about the danger of insulating yourself from challenge, about the importance of honest training partners, about how reputation could become a prison if it diverged too far from reality. He wrote about ego and humility, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about the responsibility that came with claiming expertise. When he finished, the document was nearly 4,000 words long. He saved it, backed it up, and filed it away. He did not plan to share it publicly, but he wanted it to exist. A private accounting of what he had witnessed and what it meant. Perhaps someday one of his students would ask the right questions, and he would share it with them, or perhaps it would remain private. Just his way of processing an experience that had changed how he understood his profession and himself. The following week, Daniel received one final message from the unknown number that had texted him months earlier. It came late at night. Just 3 words. I'm sorry. Daniel. That was all. No explanation. No request. No indication of what the apology was for or what would come next. Daniel stared at his phone for a long time, typed and deleted several responses, and finally settled on silence. Some things did not require answers. Some apologies arrived too late to change anything but needed to be offered anyway. Into the void. Just so the person offering them could know they had tried. He never heard from Steven Seagal again. Years would pass, and Daniel's training facility would grow, and his reputation would solidify, and young fighters and stunt performers would come to him seeking honest instruction in a field too often filled with exaggeration and mythology. And sometimes, when they were ready to hear it, he would tell them about the night in Monterey when truth and illusion collided, about what it looked like when decades of careful construction came apart in minutes, about the choices people made when forced to confront the gap between who they claimed to be and who they actually were. And he would end these stories the same way every time, standing in front of those two photographs on his wall, his voice quiet but firm. In martial arts, as in life, you can lie to the world for a while. You can surround yourself with people who reinforce your delusions. You can build a career on claims you never test. But eventually, reality comes calling. And when it does, you have two choices. You can face it honestly and rebuild on solid ground, or you can retreat into bitterness and isolation. Most people choose the second option. It's easier. It hurts less in the short term, but it means spending the rest of your life as a ghost, haunting the edges of a community that moved on without you. He would pause then, letting the words settle, watching his students process the lesson. Then he would return to the training mat, and they would practice techniques that worked, under conditions that mattered, with partners who would resist honestly. And in that practice, in that commitment to truth over image, they would honor not the man who had fallen, but the principle his fall had illuminated. The martial arts needed all its traditions, even the flawed ones. But more than tradition, more than technique, more than lineage or reputation, they needed practitioners who understood that the greatest battle was not against an opponent, but against the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. Steven Seagal had lost that battle, perhaps never truly fought it, and his absence from the community was both a loss and a lesson. The door remained open, at least in theory, but some doors are never walked through, no matter how long they stay ajar. And maybe that was the final lesson, that redemption is always possible but rarely pursued, that change requires a courage most people do not possess, and that sometimes the best we can do is learn from other people's failures what path not to take ourselves. In the end, Steven Seagal became exactly what Daniel had said he would never put on his wall, a cautionary tale, valuable precisely because he refused to be anything else.